Okay. Well, welcome everybody to a special program on loons by Dana and Bob Fox. This is a Hampshire Bird Club education workshop. We totally love presenting these to all of you and love that you are able to see them after we record them and you can't make it and you can come back and keep watching. A special treat about Dana and Bob is they have been longtime birders. They have over 750 birds in the US, and they do some special trips to New Hampshire. Tonight we're going to hear a real special thing on loons and in New England. And one of the ways that you can participate in helping monitor loon nests that are near us. We also have Monique here, who's also on the Ed Committee, and she is going to monitor the chat box. Put your questions in the chat box and we'll ask them afterwards. So don't hesitate. Take it away, Dana.
Thank you so much, Janice, and thank you so much to all of you tuning in. I've actually hidden Bob and I for the moment because sometimes it covers up what we'd like to talk about, but we're going to move right along because loons are simply wonderful. We're going to talk tonight about what makes a loon, their evolution, the world's 5 loons, their life cycle, threats, status, and conservation efforts. So here we go. What is a loon? It's a water bird adapted for diving. It has this torpedo-shaped body. You can see it in the illustration on the top right. It has that long dagger-like bill. You can see it in the lower picture. And the feet are placed way back on the body. And there are a lesser number of air sacs in their bones. And they have that typical black and white plumage. Here again is an illustration of their structure, bone structure. You can see that torpedo shape again in the illustration on the lower right. And look how the legs are actually attached. They're at the very back of the body. Wow. Bob is going to talk to you about the evolution of loons and their phylogenetic position.
Okay, I'm like Dana. I'm glad to be with you guys again, and and I know when you saw the woodpecker talk, you realize that I like to start with this tree of life. It's a chart. I want to take a little bit of time to look at it. It's a list of 249 living families of birds, the oldest at the bottom, generally speaking. If you look at the bottom line, you'll see a horizontal line. You'll see that millions of years ago that are represented. And as you go to the left, you'll see eventually you see a dotted line going all the way up through the whole chart, which is at the 50 million year limit. That's old even for birds. But if you go a little farther, you're going to see a little arrow on the bottom, and that is at 66 million years ago. What happened then? The Earth was hit by an asteroid that was 10 miles wide. It ended up down by Yucatan, but it really knocked the whole world cockeyed. Tornadoes, lava flowing, all of this thing, and all of the reptiles that were here, the dinosaurs and all of that, were virtually wiped out at that point. So you can follow that line up with because it's between the gray and the white. That's another way to tell it. I want to tell you a couple of things about dates as we are going to look at the things a little more close up. The first thing is loons began, according to an article that came out only in April 2021. And it said that loons began 70 million years ago. And the first the first fossils were 35 million years ago, and later on, when we get to the common loons, they began 20 million years ago. But in Wikipedia, they came up with a lot more information. They said the first fossil, probably the 35 million year one, was in Czechoslovakia in Europe. And at that point, Europe and North America were closer together, the continent spread, so that the loons quickly evolved into the Atlantic Ocean of the North America and then spread across to the Pacific Ocean. But then another sort of a thing happened. Wikipedia, in their article, said that the loons began in 65 million years ago, was different from 70. But an article that has just come out, February 12th, 2024, quite recent, you must admit, and a fossil has been found in Essex, England, that is 55 million years ago. Oxford Press put it out, and it's really got the changes in the date. So you can see how in the last 5 years, news about these birds have turned around dramatically. Now, what is on your screen right now is the phylogeny of birds. You notice that all of these are in blue, blue color, 4 or 5 families. The bottom one, meaning the earliest, is loons, and then it's penguins, fulmars, cormorants, ibis, herons, and pelicans. They're all water birds, you can say, connected with the water. And if you look over to the left side, you can see how those lines sort of all coalesce right there in the lower left-hand corner. You can trace them around. So the earlier things that I would have said is before 40 million years ago, the evolution is vague. But recently, as you can see, there's a lot of good information. Gavia is the genus name, and it is likely that it was involved with another genus that has become extinct. But at 40 million years ago, Gavia split from that one and has continued on until today. Gavia has at least 10 species now that have been extinct, so it's been an active area. Before the Gavias, the Fortis, right now, at 4.8 million years ago, the red loon split from Gavias. Then the common and yellow-billed loons evolved 1 million later, and they split away. And then the second division was for the Pacific and Arctic. Now, here's a picture of them, and we're going to, at the bottom of the area there, you can see the chart with the little arrow being into the mainstream of Gavia. But Gavia, you can see at the top, split first and has the little red-throated loon, and then it split a second time, and in turn, each of those split twice, so that the yellow-billed and Great Northern split out from that group, and then the last group was the Arctic and the Pacific, and they split out last.
Okay.
Now we're going to take a look at the pictures. You're going to do that?
Right.
Okay.
Now we're going to talk about the 5 loon species that exist in the world today. And you can see here are a couple pictures of the red-throated loon. It's a beautiful loon. Bob and I were in Alaska in the spring a couple of years ago, and it just is a magnificent bird on the breeding territory. You can see where it winters in red, and its North American breeding range in blue. Here is its world range. Here, in this case, yellow is breeding and the blue is winter. Now, the Arctic loon has these very definitive patches, and I can remember we were up in on the shores of northwestern Alaska, and there were Arctic loons off the coast, and those patches were so distinctive. And you can see there's some breeding in Alaska, but very limited, more over.
What you will notice on those, though, that the Arctic loon has a black throat and a light top to the head. Keep
Great,
that in
okay.
mind.
And here is their world breeding range and their winter range. This is not a bird that we see here off the Massachusetts coast. The Pacific loon, here again, is its breeding range and winter range.
And you see it has a black throat and a light head.
Okay. And its world range.
Uh,
And then the yellow bill loon, we saw this up in Barrow. It's really an impressive bird. And you may have seen just recently where some poor ill-fated yellow bill loon arrived in a fountain in Las Vegas, of all things. I can't believe this poor bird's surprise. They turned off the fountain and they eventually caught it and took it and released it. But this is an impressive looking bird.
Loons can fly south some of them a great deal. They've sometimes shown up down at the Mexican border, surprisingly.
We have seen this one in New York State, and it's a very, very rare loon in this part of the world. You can see its limited breeding range and winter range. Now, here is our common loon, Gavia imma. This is a picture of it here in a painting. You can see its breeding range and its winter range. And there really are three populations of the common loon. There's the sort of northeast region, there's a upper Midwest region, and then there's Alaska and down through the Washington, Oregon state area.
They're slightly different in sizes.
And here is their world range. Now, common loons, they think there may be as many as 264,000 in the world, but 580,000 individuals. 90% of those breed in Canada, 70% winter off either the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic coast, and 30% off the Pacific coast. In 2023, we had nearly 2,200 territorial pairs in New England. We had 51 in Mass, Vermont had 90, New Hampshire had 310. Maine is not quite sure exactly what they have, but it may be as many as 1,700 pairs, and Connecticut has had one. This, you see, is the density of common loons nesting in Canada. You can see that great density around the Great Lakes, out on Nova Scotia. And now the life cycle of the loon is fascinating. Right now, they build their nests usually in in New Hampshire by June 5th, close to the shoreline or on a raft. They usually have no more than 2 eggs, and the adults shift back and forth every 4 to 6 hours in shifts sitting on the eggs. They hatch in 27 days, so that would be about the 7th of July in New Hampshire on the old schedule. They're very susceptible to lead poisoning from fishing gear. They will molt into their winter plumage in the fall, and the young will not fledge, i.e. leave that natal lake until they're 10 to 12 weeks old, after which both parents have left. So they make their way to their winter grounds on their own. The chicks and the adults leave in the late fall. They fly usually to the ocean, and there is very great winter sight fidelity. We have a friend who used to look off the coast of central Maine, and she could see the same loon because of his colored bands every year in the area along her coastal place. The chicks spend 3 years on the ocean and finally return to the near where they hatch, usually within 10 miles of where they hatch. But they won't breed for another 2 to 3 years. The adult loons move onto the lakes right after the ice is out, and some abandoned. We have a friend who said he saw the loons circling the lake the day before the ice went out. They seek a mate, but they do not mate for life. And they feed primarily on bait fish. They love perch. Now let's listen to the calls of the loon. Their wail is this whoo, whoo, whoo. You probably have heard that in the summertime, in the dark. It's a very, very distinctive sound, and it is just so charismatic and so wonderful to hear it. Now, they also have a wail, which is a laughing call. They do it often when they're in flight, and they often give it when they're alarmed or to announce their presence on a lake. Now, the third one is only given by the male. It's a very defensive one. He's defending his territory. And in fact, the most amazing part of it is we've heard them respond to low flying small planes over lakes in the summer. It just is absolutely amazing to hear this loon, absolutely male loon, going spastic when there's a small little biplane over a lake. And then they have a very soft sounding hoot, which they give to one another. And it may be from parent to parent or to a chick. And it's just this lovely little soft sound that they give. No. So this is their molting schedule. They molt back into their adult plumage, this amazing black and white plumage, in March before returning to the freshwater lakes. They're usually on the ocean at this point, the adults, and they will be at least 3 years old at this point, because the ones younger than that will not be returning and will not have molted into this adult plumage. They then in the fall go into what they call the alternate plumage, into basic plumage rather, and they get this gray and white plumage gradually in the fall. It's funny watching the patches of fall plumage come in. Now in January, look what happens to their wing feathers. It just is extraordinary. And many of us didn't know about this until there was this incident up on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire, where suddenly these loons were trapped by the ice, and this brave staff member from the Loon Preservation Committee in Moultonborough went out on the ice and actually caught them and found that they were unable to fly. Not only were they still there on the lake as it froze, but they couldn't have left even if they could have managed to take off, because they had this total wing molt. And this usually occurs when they're on the ocean, but nowadays when lakes are not freezing over, this is occurring on freshwater lakes. And if they suddenly freeze up, these birds are in trouble. Now, the young have a molt schedule. They have this downy black plumage, and I can remember holding on to one as its parents were being banded up in New Hampshire one night. And then they go into this juvenile basic plumage at about 6 weeks, and they usually move to the ocean for the next 2 years, and they have these distinctive plumages during, and gradually they begin to, by the 3rd year, develop the adult plumage. Now, what we have with these extraordinary birds is that they become very bonded to one another in what they call territorial pairs. And they are just sort of like glued together. They move across the lake in tandem. I love this picture on the right where you see how close and how bonded they are, moving along in the lake. Beautiful. It's not possible to tell the male from the female, although she is usually bigger. Here they are again on a nest. This is where you have this floating raft nest. This is one of the most elegant ones in the world, I think. And here is a pair. You can see 2 eggs beneath the parent, assuming the nesting egg keeping warm or cool. And here is the young that has protruded. The eggs they're usually 2 eggs, and they will hatch a day apart. In that day in between, the first youngster will climb back on the nest with the parent and stay there until the second egg is hatched, and then they all will leave the nest forever. They never return. I'm going to show you a series of pictures that I just find charming. And very often, as you know, the young will float on the back of the adults. Just so cute. And they love to spread their feet and wave their feet in the air. Look at him lying on his back there, waving his wings. It's not sure. Both the adults and the young will often wave a leg. They may be thermoregulating. It's not quite sure why they do that. But here this young is looking for attention. You can see how this younger loon is beginning to develop its wing feathers. 2 young loons. You can see what they're like at 4 weeks, at 6 weeks, at 8 and 11. They slowly assume what you recognize more. Look at the size of that fish. The Loon Preservation Committee there in Moulton Borough actually has a stuffed loon that died because it caught a bass that was too big for it to swallow, and the bass got stuck in its throat, and both the fish and the loon died. Now, in the spring, they're often very aggressive when they're trying to secure a mate, and they do this dancing across the water, and then they come up and they do this penguin-like, it's called the penguin walk here. This is pictures taken at night of when they have captured these adult loons, and they're applying both the Fish and Wildlife Band as well as color tags. And the color tags are a very specific color combination that allows you to identify a specific bird. You can always find out where and when that bird was banded if you have the color combinations, and they usually put 4 on, and because they do this leg waving, you often have an opportunity to see the colored bands. Here's another extraordinary size fish this poor loon was trying to. Is a young loon getting ready. there are threats that they face. Lead fishing tackle. If they happen to swallow a lead sinker or a lead-headed jig, a lead-headed fishing tackle, in 2 weeks, they're dead because the sinker or the lure ends up in their gizzard, and the gizzard is meant to be there to help grind up things. So it grinds this lead containing item and it spreads into their bloodstream, and very soon they're dead. They also are trapped often in that monofilament line. Climate change is having a significant impact on them. Last year, due to climate change in New Hampshire and in Mass, we had a lot of rain during the nesting season. 40 nests in New Hampshire were destroyed by rising water. And once the nest is flooded, there's no going back. There's a particular black fly that is only found on loons. Can you imagine? Of course, human interference, development, harassment is a problem. Their own aggressive behavior towards one another. Eagles now are turning into be quite a challenge. There are mammalian predators, particularly for the eggs during the nesting season. And these water level changes, 6 inches of lake rise and 12 inches of lake drop can often doom a lake nesting season for a pair of loons.
That's the reason they developed these rafts that float and can allow that to cure that problem.
And then there are, of course, oil spills and chemical contaminants that these poor birds are facing. This shows the percentage of threats that birds in New Hampshire have been facing. You can see the most predominant source of demise of loons is due to lead tackle. And then we have fishing tackle itself. There are so many things like boat collisions, gunshots, avian malaria, trauma, different diseases. And this is a x-ray taken, and you can see where that lead fishing tackle was located there in the gizzard of this particular loon. And that's often the way they quickly determine whether a loon that appears to be sick has lead problems. Here is an example of that monofilament line that is trapping them. They can't move, fly, feed. We also are finding now with climate change that heat is also an issue. Some of these birds have historically nested right out in the open. And you can see this loon is panting with the weight of and here's another panting loon out in the open. Here are the black flies that Simalumium analis, that is the particular black fly species that only subjects its attention to loons. And in fact, they have been driven crazy, certain pairs of them, certain years. And if they get off the nest and try and get in the water and try and get rid of the black flies by diving, that will often leave the eggs either to be cooked by the sun or chilled beyond repair if it's a cold day, or enable them to be predated by mammalian predators. Look at this loon here amongst this highly developed shoreline. And this particular image on the right shows how there are all these houses along this little bay. And this poor loon is trying to nest amongst all of this human activity. There is very aggressive behavior that they exert towards the opposite male. Many males will try and win the attention of a female. And the picture on the lower right shows that their sternum is subjected to these aggressive attacks where they actually pierce the sternum of the other loon in their aggressive behavior. It just is amazing how many of these sternums are just these days peppered with holes. Now, eagles have also become an amazing threat to them. And you can see the picture on the left where the loon is jumping out of the water to try and protect itself or maybe its young from an aggressive loon. And on the right, there actually was a loon whose heart was actually dissected by a loon jumping out of the water and piercing the eagle's sternum and killing it. We don't know of many other cases exactly like that, but we do know that there are many encounters these days. As I mentioned, 12 inches of lake water drop will often cause the loon to abandon their nests because their legs are placed so far back on their body, they are not able to get further up on the shoreline if there is a great water drop on a particular lake. This is a quote by William Brewster. As they offered conspicuous and attractive targets for rifle target and were wholly unprotected either by law or by popular sentiment, it was customary to shoot at them whenever opportunity offered. Often the progress of the steamer up the lake, this is Lake Mbagog, was indicated and proclaimed by the frequent popping of guns fired from her decks at loons and other waterfowl. And that was in William Brewster's Birds of the Lake Mbagog region of Maine in 1924. This is the status of loons in New Hampshire. We're going to talk now about what's going on in the individual states. You can see how many pairs are in different regions of the state. And this is the growth. The Loon Protection Committee was set up in 1975 because loons had really dropped in such significant numbers. You can see this is in 85 and they would start in 75. And you can see the progress that they've made in trying to protect and encourage the nesting of loons and growth in the population there. And the lower blue line is the number of lakes with nesting pairs, and the upper line is the number of territorial pairs, those bonded pairs that I showed you. Now, this is a little bit complicated, but you have the paired adults in a red. You have the nesting adults. So not all paired adults are going to nest. So fewer of them will nest. Then you have the number of chicks hatched in the blue and the chicks surviving. They are monitoring them for at least 10 weeks, the nesting loons in New Hampshire. And they have so many challenges that not all of them make it. Now in Vermont, these are the diagrams of where there are nesting loons. It's interesting to see the pattern. The right-hand one is the lower part of the state, and you can see that the pattern of loon nesting in northern Vermont. And this is a growth in the number of loons, adult loons with the box, black box. And then there are quite a few, as we mentioned before, between 3 to 5 or 6-year-olds on lakes these days, and then the number of chicks. In Maine, we don't have very good statistics because there is not any one body that is looking at them. And of course, they have so many lakes and such a large state. But in the southern Maine lakes, they're surveyed by Maine Audubon. The Rangeley and Belgrade lakes are monitored now and by a series of different efforts. The Biological Research Institute of Portland, Maine has 33 lakes that they monitor very closely that are actually reservoirs. And now there is a project having volunteers in the Rangeley and Belgrade lakes. And then all the other lakes, the Maine Fish and Wildlife Department is responsible for, although they are not doing active monitoring. In Massachusetts, this quote by Edward Howe Forbush: 50 years ago, they nested about many ponds in Massachusetts. Now I know of none where a breeding pair may be surely found. They were shot out at great expenditure of powder or lead, or driven out by continual persecution. They died hard, but they're gone, perhaps never to return. Now, this was a quote from his book of the Birds of Massachusetts and Other New England States in 1925. Now, what is extraordinary is that they were extirpated in Massachusetts, but the first recent loon nesting occurred in the state in 1975 at Quabbin. And now we have found that there were 52 territorial pairs this past year. 20 were at Quabbin, 6 were at Wachusett, and then we had territorial pairs in the following towns. And you can see the map here and in here. So you can see they've moved out from that original pair in the Quabbin area, and they're establishing a population in the Berkshires. And then there was a special attempt to rear some in Middleborough. And then we have these rather bizarre little places like in Haverhill, there's been a pair. And there was a pair in Lincoln last year and in Hopkinton. And this shows the growth of them within Massachusetts, both with territorial pairs and lakes. But the thing that is disturbing is that they've calculated that you need to have a 4.4 something level of success in chicks, because remember, it takes 5 to 6 years before a chick is going to produce a young. And so they've developed this formula that you have to have that level of success. And you can see that originally this was the case in Massachusetts, but in recent years, we've been dropping below the not having successful number of young chicks. And I know that the state officials told me that last year they had a very poor nesting success or chick survival success because of the fact that there was so much competition between loon pairs and or unmated loons that there just was chaos, and many pairs didn't even get to nest or weren't successful as a result of the harassment of the unmated loons. So this is something that we've got to pay careful attention to in Mass. There's been a translocation project, and what they do is they take these pens. This is a project that the state of Mass has worked closely to develop, and the project has been run by the Biological Research Institute of Portland, Maine, for the state. And originally there were 24 chicks. The project started in 2015 to 17, and then we had it go until from 2016 2020, and they would bring in young chicks from Maine or New York and bring them to Southeast Mass, put them in these pens, keep
Feed
the
them.
feed them. In fact, they had a tube where they would drop the fish down the tube into the water and have the loons learn to chase the fish. And they concealed people from the loons, so they never saw that there were actual people doing this. And some were brought in old enough to release directly. Others were, as I said, kept in the pens until they were old enough to work for food on their own. They were having, and then they were watching. Of course, it took a couple of years for them to be old enough to return, to see whether or not you would be able to translocate these and have these translocated birds identify with this new area as their natal area. They've had about 38% of the loons that they originally or early on actually released returning. They've had one actually nest in the state. They saw one actually up at Silver Lake in Madison, New Hampshire. And they have continued to do this project now in starting last year, and it will end this year out in the Berkshires. So that's why they're getting an additional influx of loons out in the Berkshires. There are some conservation efforts that the Department of Conservation and Recreation are employing, where they're collecting lead-bearing sinkers and fishing lures, and also line there. And you can see how much they've collected in the past few years. As Janice mentioned in the beginning, we're looking to try and encourage some volunteer monitoring, which is so very important in both Vermont, Massachusetts, and Maine. So we're asking you, if you live in or nearby one of those towns in green on that map and have free time during the loon nesting season, May and June, whether you'd be able to monitor some of the nesting loons, and certainly also keep track of whether or not you see loons on any of the lakes in the state, because as the population increases, hopefully they will gradually move out and begin to nest on additional lakes. Contact me, and I am working and will provide this closely with the state ornithologist, Drew Vitz, and I will provide that information to him. And starting next year, we will probably have a formal program where we are having a citizen volunteer monitoring program for loons in the state. I just want to say that you feel free to contact us, the Loon Preservation Committee in New Hampshire, the Biological Research Institute in Maine, our ornithologist, Andrew Vitz, in Maine, Danielle Duria is the Fish and Wildlife contact person. In Vermont, the Center for Eco Studies is Eric Hansen. In closing, we hope you enjoyed this talk about our simply wonderful loons. And we thank Janice for inviting us and for the club for hosting us and for all of you watching. And we look forward to your questions. Now, let's see if I can I bring myself back, Janice?
We think so.
Okay.
First, you can stop sharing, and then you want to change your video setting.
All right.
And I know we do have questions.
Yes,
we do
I
we do
see in
have
the
some
chat
questions.
that we do have there. Okay. Stop the video, right? Okay, I've got to find how to stop the share. All righty, it's not telling. Stop share. Yes, okay.
All right.
There you are. There you are. Okay. Good.
And then if you want to for your video change the setting so we get to see who you and Bob are.
Right. Start video.
There you
Yeah,
go.
we see you. We're good.
Oh, good. All
But
right.
we don't see Bob. Okay,
Okay,
Bob.
there he is. There he
In
is.
there.
Good.
So Dana and Bob, thank you so much. We have a few questions for you. One question we have is, who makes the floating raft that we saw the loons on?
Okay, there are a variety of designs, and usually the individual the states have been organizing raft building or giving directions on how to build them there, and there are some that have been using wood, some that have been using artificial wood, and there've been many have been putting that canvas over the top, or that loose cloth, to give them some protection from the heat, and maybe even protection from predators from above. I'd be glad to, but usually the states organizations that are actively involved in that want to help assess if someone thinks there should be a nesting raft on their lake or in their area, they should contact the appropriate person in their state and have them evaluate whether that's appropriate, whether there've been failures due to water level rise, and often with dammed lakes, that's a problem. And secondly, help in deciding where to put it.
Okay. Another question. Aren't lead sinkers banned now? What about lead shot?
Well, remember that banning something, what many of you may not know is I spent quite a few years dealing with the issue of household hazardous waste. And one of the things that we discovered so vividly during my years working on that is that whether something is banned bears no relationship to whether it's being used or whether it's still in the barn or the basement or the garage. And eventually, particularly with fishing tackle boxes, grandpa's old fishing lures, if the grandchildren come to the house, may be taken and used. So we really need to be proactive to go through our tackle boxes and to remove them. Yes, in the laws differ from state to state, but we are now with sinkers, I think, in pretty good place for new things, but that doesn't deal with the past.
Okay. Another question we have here is, do the sterum punctures kill the loon?
No. Not one puncture. As you could see, that loon picture that I showed you, that sternum head had quite a few different punctures. So one in of itself isn't going to, but in time, and depending upon, and I'm not an expert on this, but I'll find out whether or not there could be a puncture that was lethal, depending upon where it ended up inside the body of the loon.
Okay, another question here. Do the male and female both sit on the eggs?
Yes, every 4 to 6 hours they change. And I can remember the last year I had loons nesting on my lake. I would go out at 6 in the morning and just float a distance, safe distance for observation from the nest and watch the loon that was about to come on to duty swim in, and the other one quickly slipped off, and the next parent assumed the responsibility of sitting on the eggs.
All right. Another question here. Is there any way to protect the loons from the black flies?
I don't know of any, and there haven't been any efforts to do anything. It would be hard to cover their head. They've still got to open that bill and feed. I don't know of anyone who's trying. The loons often, are driven crazy to the point where they'll leave the nest, and often if they dive in the water, they can rid their head of the black flies momentarily. But I have not heard of anything that is preventing that.
Finally, we have one last question. How big of a lake does a loon want to consider nesting there?
I think it's 50 acres that is the size that they usually. There are some loons that have managed to go to adjacent, very close lakes and feed, where their lake may not be big enough to support fish population or a food population that is sufficient. I know on my family's pond up in New Hampshire, we have the most bizarre situation. Somehow the state decided to put trout in the lake. They were never there, but they decided to introduce trout because it was deep in one place. And now the trout, particularly the brown trout, have become so big and voracious that they have eaten about anything that might move, whether that be salamanders or frogs or crayfish, or even bloodsuckers. I mean, we used to have bloodsuckers, but no more. I swear those trout, because they're so big and voracious, and the lake is of a limited size, they just don't have a great prey base to, and so I'm very unhappy with the stocking of our pond. And we used to have, prior to the stocking, a very large variety of freshwater fish, and a lot of perch that the loons like. We had hornpout, we had a smallmouth bass, you had so many sunfish. You couldn't get your line down with a worm on it down to the bass. They were so thick. Shiners, and now there's just bass and trout. And thus we have in my opinion, no nesting loons, because there's no small fish to feed them.
Couple of questions have come in. Who has seen a nesting pair in Ludlow Reservoir? Has anyone?
This is Janice. A year or so ago, when we had a presentation on birding locations in Hampden County, there was someone who had seen a nesting pair in the Ludlow Reservoir with babies. So when it showed that Springfield area, I'm thinking that's one of the sites in Springfield, as opposed to being Quabbin. But I didn't know if anybody on here had seen them.
Not
Okay.
all of the sites are reservoirs. I mean, Wachusett and Quabbin are, and there are a couple of water supply lakes that are monitored by the Department of Conservation and Recreation. They call it DCR. But the majority of the lakes are just straight local lakes.
Another question. So if I see a loon on a smaller lake, is it probably just stopping by for a snack?
That's what you're going to determine by careful observation, because you may see you're going to have to sit there, hopefully with binoculars. So if there's any chance that it's been banded with those color bands, you could pick up the color combinations. But that's the whole thing that we're going to find, hopefully, that, and as has happened, that loons have populated more and more lakes over time. So that's possible if you have a lake, particularly in the central or the western part of the state, where there may now be successful growth in the population, that they're going to populate new lakes. So you have to keep an eye out and report it to us. If you see one, fine.
If you're lucky, you sometimes see them on rivers, and then they're not too far away. And as they usually lift one foot or another every so often, you can get an idea like red over white over blue type of reporting.
Yeah, a couple of comments here. This, I'll thank you. I'll look next time. This was at Savoy, I guess, when they were looking at some loons. And another comment is, with the other bird clubs, birders go to Ludlow Reservoir and they've seen a loon there, but they don't know about a nesting pair or pairs at that reservoir.
Right. You just have to, and for a while, they'll have that territorial pair behavior before, they will not begin to nest immediately in the spring. So you can begin to see if there is a pair. Once they start nesting, you'll obviously only see one at a time. Now, I see Jim Lafley is on the call, and I think Jim worked at Quabbin. Someone was telling me, so he may know more about the loons at Quabbin. I understand they just had such difficult year last year because of the aggressive behavior between the unmated loons and the loons that had paired up, that they just had unsuccessful chick raising.
Yeah, it also can happen at Wachusett Reservoir as well. Unfortunately, what happens is the younger birds that were raised there return to that reservoir rather than head to other bodies of water that they may find a mate or whatever and start breeding there. They come back to the prime breeding area, and that causes issues as the population increases.
Thank you, Jim.
Any other questions?
Greetings to your wife, Jim.
Thank you, Dana. I'm right here. Great talk.
Wonderful.
That's all we have for questions.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, this has been such fun. And also, I wanted to just make an announcement that if any of you are brave and wanting to hear the gentleman who saw 10,000 species of birds in the world, Peter Kessner from Maryland, the Nuttall Ornithological Club is sponsoring a talk by him May 14th at 7 p.m. in Cambridge. All of the bird clubs will be sent notice of this, and everyone is welcome. And there is a, I'll send it to Janice so she has it as well. There's a URL to sign up to register for it, but it's free, and he's just a fascinating individual. And he was in the Peace Corps in Zaire, and then he went to work for the State Department. That's the job to get if you want to look at birds in the world, I've decided. So imagine seeing 10,000 species. Bob and I have seen 6,000 some odd, but oh my Lord, 10,000.
Okay, this is Janice again. If there are no more questions, going once, going twice.
It's just another 4,000.
I know. You have time, Bob and Dana, you have time. One is I want to thank you very much. I want to tell all of you that this has been recorded and will be posted on our Hampshire Bird Club education page, where we have all the videos of all the things. And thank you so much for such an informative. I love those photos. Those photos are like, wow, wow,
Yeah.
wow. And remember, if you are interested in helping monitor for the loons, we'll post that again on Hampshire Bird Club and on the Facebook page, because I'm sure some of you might be interested.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Janice. It's been delightful.
Great, thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Night all.
Bye, bye, Dana and Bob.
I'm going to stop recording. Where's the record button?